Okay, for this lecture, we're going to talk a little bit about Darwin's theory and basically where it came from, what he was trying to explain with this theory, and why he wasn't satisfied with the, at the time, current explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. We're going to focus mainly, though, on what's required for natural selection to occur, what exactly natural selection is, and how it happens. And also the problems faced by small populations in particular in responding to changes in the environment. Basically, what it makes it more difficult for small populations to evolve, or any population to evolve and respond to environmental change. Okay, so Charles Darwin, we know is, of course, the founder of Darwinian natural selection. And so everyone's sort of a household name now, but about when he was approximately your age, maybe a little bit older, he was in medical school at Cambridge University and completely miserable. At the time, there were very few job opportunities for men of his social standing that were considered to be acceptable, right? And so his major choices were going into medicine or going into the clergy, joining the church and serving as a vicar. And he's in medical school, and like I said, completely miserable. He's not at all interested in his anatomy and physiology classes, cutting open cadavers and so on. And so he's taking basically all the other courses he can think of to try to avoid taking those courses he didn't like, which are things like he was taking zoology. I think he took a course on biological and natural illustration. So he learned how to draw and label scientific diagrams. He took a lot of courses in geology and botany. And it was actually through a contact of his botany professor where he learned about the job on the Beagle in 1831. Now, interestingly, this was a job. Actually, it's more like what we would consider today a volunteer internship, because not only did he not get paid, but he actually had to pay to go on to this voyage because they had to cover the cost of his food and supplies and things like that. But they were looking for, again, his botany professor knew someone else who was leading an expedition to map the coast of South America. It was a cartographic journey, and they wanted a naturalist to be able to record the species that they observe and take samples and drawings and things like that, because of course this is the days before you had cameras, right? And I believe this portrait that he sat for here, it was either right before or right after the voyage on the Beagle. So relatively young man here in this picture. So again, he joined this. He was thinking, okay, this is an awesome opportunity, right? And it's not just a job; it's an adventure, right? And so he decided to go on the voyage. He brought everything he had been reading at the time, so a lot of, again, geology texts and other things that were full of ideas about change, geological change, and how you could get really big changes from very small changes over time, and then you get this additive effect, right? So, for example, the erosion action of water could eventually lead to something like the Grand Canyon. So he's starting to think about stuff like that, right? And again, this is very different than the general way of thinking at the time. Now, of course, we're like, well, it's intuitively obvious, but not necessarily so. And so he was bringing all of that stuff with him and reading at night when he wasn't throwing up because he got terribly, terribly seasick, poor man, and was really excited when they would, basically, throw over the anchor and everybody would get off the boat and the cartographers started doing their measurements and surveys to map the coastline, and he would venture inland a little bit to take some samples of the plants and draw the animals and take notes about everything that he saw on this trip. And so they mapped the coast of South America, including the Galapagos Islands, which are on the off the western coast of South America. And of course, it's an island chain, so they have to go all the way around all the islands, right, in order to map them. So he spent a lot of time in this archipelago. And there he was, in addition to his other travels, and as I said, things he had been studying in museum specimens and other things in his college courses, he was struck by a few things. One, of course, the diversity of life on Earth, all of the different kinds of organisms that are out there. But he was also struck by how well they are suited to their environment, right? He noted in particular his, the finches that are now named for him, right? Darwin's finches, how well the size of the beak matched the food that they were eating, right? So birds that had large, heavy beaks were eating large, heavy seeds. And birds that had really tiny beaks were eating tiny seeds. And he even saw birds that had long, thin beaks like a hummingbird's, and they were actually drinking nectar out of flowers. Some were eating insects. I mean, he was very struck by how well those morphological characteristics allowed those animals to succeed tremendously in their environment. At the same time, he was also able to notice not only the diversity of life, but also that he could pretty easily figure out, oh, I see some birds or whatever that are similar. I'm wondering if they may be related. I'm seeing what I think are family resemblances, right? So even the finches on the Galapagos Islands that were so fabulously diverse in their beak sizes and configurations, he could pretty well say, hey, those actually look somewhat similar to the finches I have at home back in England on the other side of the world, right? And so he was trying to think of, okay, I'm seeing all of this stuff and I'm taking all these notes and I'm really thinking about all these things and then trying to bring it together into one sort of cohesive theory to try and explain all of that. And that basically took him almost his entire life to do that. It took him several decades to put together a manuscript and a working theory. And so we're basically just going to hit the highlights of that working theory here. So just really quickly, here's a family tree of Darwin's finches as we know them now. And this actually doesn't capture all of the finch species, but it's basically a subsample of them. But of course, you can see how they all trace back to one common ancestor coming over from South America. We know this from fossil specimens, but of course now someone has done the genetic analysis and also can trace back the origin of all of these species back to one, in particular, a relatively small sample from one species that was blown over by a storm, presumably, and ended up on the Galapagos Islands and found a place where, hey, guess what? There's no predators here, and thankfully there's food. So we're just going to hang out here and just make a living on these islands, and the population grows and so on and so forth. That's actually a relatively rare to have that happen, right? Most groups of organisms that end up in an entirely new place, they either are not well suited to the environment where they end up, and so they die, unfortunately. Otherwise, we'd have a whole lot more problems with invasive species than we actually do right now. And of course, when you have individuals come over, you have a very small population. They have some challenging issues as well, and we're going to talk about that more towards the end of the lecture when we talk about genetic drift. But in any event, we can see the diversity of the beak sizes in particular and the corresponding diets that he was observing in these different species of finches while he was there. And of course, every island in the Galapagos has its own set of finch species. And some islands there's only one. Some islands have several, depending on the size and the diversity of habitats that are present on the island. So he got a chance to see a lot of different types of species here. And so he coined the phrase to try and capture these characteristics that allowed organisms to be well suited to their environment. He called them adaptations. And these are characteristics that help a population of organisms succeed in their environment. And by succeed, we mean that they are able to survive well enough and long enough to be able to reproduce. And in particular, in some cases, we have characteristics that actually enhance just reproduction, and they don't really affect longevity, but they allow those individuals to have more offspring, which means more chances to pass on your genes. Okay, so all of these observations, as well as what he was reading at the time, which of course included works by geologists, but also included some works by Malthus on economics, actually, and how, you know, the question Malthus posed was, why aren't we up to our eyeballs in ants and beetles and things like that, which we sort of are, but but basically he was asking, you know, we have so many more individuals are born than can possibly survive. And the idea was you have limited resources. Resources are not infinite in their abundance, and that some individuals may be better at accessing those resources than others. And that basically leads to kind of population control, essentially. So Darwin was basically the foundation for his theory came from a few assumptions, and he was very explicit about those, as any good scientist would be, right? You write down, here are the things I'm assuming to be true, and then you can present, right, your supporting data and your analysis, and then you come to your conclusions. So the first thing that he put forth as that I'm assuming this is a foregone conclusion, I'm not going to debate it. This is something I'm assuming to be true, which is offspring resemble their parents, right? You have some sort of characteristics that are similar among groups of organisms because they inherited them from their ancestors, right? Now, we now know, right, that those are genes, and you inherit different versions of genes from your parents depending on which versions they had, and which ones you happen to get as a result of various processes like meiosis that occur in the gametes of your parents, to give you your unique combination of characteristics that have never been present in anyone else before and probably won't ever be duplicated again. So when someone says you're special, you absolutely are. There's been no one like you ever in the history of this planet, which I think is really mind-blowingly awesome. So he was assuming that to be true. Again, he had no idea about, you know, what genes were. Mendel's work on pea plants, right, that identified what he called them factors or particles. But we now know he was basically tracking the movement of chromosomes during meiosis. He was doing those experiments 40 years after Darwin published his on the origin of species, so which is outlining his theory. So Mendel knew about Darwin, but Darwin had no idea about Mendel's work because Mendel really hadn't started his work yet. So that's always good to remember. So he took that basically as a foregone conclusion. Offspring resemble their parents. Okay. And that factors into part of his theory, how selection actually works, as we're going to see here on the next slide here in just a minute. He also, again, assumed to be true Malthus's conclusions, which were far more young are born than can possibly survive. Therefore, you have competition for limited resources. And again, those resources could be umpteen billion different things that living things need. But the idea is there is not enough to go around, and for everyone to, you know, have maximum number of offspring and everybody survives all the time. It's just not possible. And so based on those two basic assumptions, as well as the things that he had been reading about, you know, slow gradual change in geology that could bring about very large changes, and other things he was reading from other scientists at the time, he basically concluded that an unequal ability to survive and reproduce leads to organisms with favorable traits passing on those traits to their offspring, right? So therefore, you end up with individuals who are better suited to the environment over time, and the population then accumulates what he referred to as adaptations, right? And an adaptation, of course, is anything that enhances survival or reproduction in a given environment. Now notice it's in a given environment, right? So this is very specific to a particular range of conditions where a population of individuals finds itself. So his idea, again, is you can pass on those characteristics because offspring resemble their parents. You automatically have some level of competition for resources. And so individuals who are better able to either compete or access resources or survive better, perhaps it's surviving a predator or whatever it is, whichever individuals are better able to pass on their genes to the next generation are going to be able to do that, and therefore those characteristics are going to accumulate in the population over time. And then his other conclusion was these modifications, these adaptations, over time in populations to an environment lead to the diversity of life that we observe today. Okay, so there are three basic criteria that need to be met in order for a population to evolve as a result of natural selection. In other words, three things that have to happen in order for natural selection to work. The first, of course, is that individuals have to be different or vary in their characteristics, right? If everybody's exactly the same, then there aren't going to be any differences in their ability to survive and reproduce in an environment, and you have no no selection is possible, no evolution is possible. We're going to talk about where that variation comes from here in just a second. The second criteria, it follows from what we were talking about earlier in terms of offspring resembling their parents. So the variation that exists has to be able to be passed from one generation to the next. Therefore, it must be heritable. That's what that means, right? You have to be able to pass on that variation. Now we know, of course, a lot of variation is generated by the interaction between genes, for example, and the environment, as we've been talking about in class right now. That's all very well and good, but if you can't pass on that variation to the next generation, or variation that occurs as a result of learning, if there's no way to pass that from parents to offspring, that may very well be useful variation, but it cannot evolve. It cannot. It can't get passed down. Therefore, you can't select for it because there's no way of getting it from one generation to the next. So that's a really important, critical step between the first step here, individuals vary in their characteristics, and the third, which of course has to do with differences in fitness. So. In general, and I mentioned this earlier, and I know I mentioned this earlier in lecture, all behaviors, I shouldn't say all, but the vast majority of behaviors have some sort of a genetic component to them. There are genes that code for, morphological features that are used in the behavior, or that are coding for the expression of hormones at particular times, or whatever it might be, the neurological circuitry that's involved in performing a behavior. So most behaviors have some sort of a genetic component to them. Later on, we're going to talk about how you can have learned behavior be passed from one generation to the next, and something we call culture. And culture can evolve because you have a mechanism for passing on that learned information from one generation to the next. But for most of the things that we're going to be talking about, it's really genetic. So you have DNA is involved. Now DNA, of course, is our master code. Everything that's alive uses DNA as its molecule of inheritance. This is the mechanism for passing changes and the mechanism for passing the code for adaptations from one generation to the next. And every cell gets a complete copy of the instructions every time cells divide, and then you pass, ideally, a full set of instructions from the parents to the offspring. So an individual's total genetic makeup we refer to as their genotype. Basically, this is all the different versions for all the different genes that exist in a member of their species. Basically, it's the complete set of instructions on how to build, a better, horse or a person or, a tree, whatever it is. That's its genotype. So where does the variation that we need, right? Individuals have to vary in characteristics, right? If everyone's exactly the same for every characteristic that's present in their species, then that population cannot evolve, which means it can't respond to changes in the environment. And you're going to get no differences between individuals in terms of their survival and ability to pass on their genes. But we have lots of sources of variation, right? So new genotypes can form as a result, as we just mentioned, sexual reproduction, right? You have individuals in pretty much all animals that we're going to be talking about. There are some very weird exceptions, but for the most part, you have sexual reproduction is used to make offspring. And so those offspring are going to be genetically different from you for two reasons. One, you're combining your genes with the genes of another individual. And two, in making gametes, right, animals use the process of meiosis, which involves actually mixing and matching genes from the chromosomes inherited from one parent with the chromosomes inherited from another parent. These, of course, have to be homologous pairs, meaning they need to code for the same set of characteristics, so that you're only swapping genes, let's say, for eye color or hair color or something like that. But you can actually splice and dice our DNA that's coming from the parent individual, and then you take those different combinations of genes and you randomly assign them to daughter cells during meiosis. And so the number of combinations that can be generated through this process is in the millions for humans, and likely to be similar for other species. So a huge way of generating a lot of variation in a very simple process involved in sexual reproduction. You can have mutations occur. Now, of course, we have to remember that for a mutation to be inherited to the next generation, it has to be present in the cells that are making gametes, right? So if a mutation occurs in your skin cells or in your liver cells or someplace else, and it's not present anywhere else in your body, it's not going to get passed on to your offspring, right? So only the mutations that are present in the cells, in the DNA of the cells that are making gametes are going to be passed on, right? But another important thing about mutation is it's our only source of new versions of genes. It's the only way we have to get new alleles. That's just basically what an allele is, a version of a gene, right? So the same gene that, say, codes for eye color may have 4 or 5 different versions, and those different versions produce different eye color combinations. Another source of variation that we don't talk about a whole lot, but is potentially really important, is something called gene duplication. And this is basically a type of mistake that occurs during DNA replication. You're not changing the version of a gene. What happens is a section of DNA gets copied more than once. So instead of having one gene, let's say for olfactory receptors, you now have 2 or 3. And they have this, initially, they're just duplicates. It's just copies. This is why extra code often, in a lot of cases, doesn't really make a huge difference. But however, if you get some mutations in that extra code, that could change what proteins are made, and it could actually change the types of, if it's olfactory receptors, for example, change what chemicals you're able to detect with your nose. And again, that could be something that is important and is helpful to have. So you get some combinations of these different types of processes. Hopefully this is all review from folks who have taken 61 or a similar course at some point in terms of how genetic variation is generated. Because as we'll see, the process of natural selection actually reduces genetic variation, and so we really do need all of these processes, or at least some of them, operating in any population of any species in order for that population to be able to continue to evolve. In other words, for individuals to vary in their characteristics, we need to have some mechanisms to generate variation. Okay, and then here comes the third part, right? So the first two were you have to vary in characteristics and have to be able to pass that variation from one generation to the next. And then the third, of course, is that variation leads to differences in fitness in a particular environment between individuals, and that's where that relative comes from, right? So your own fitness is always relative to basically how well you're doing is relative to how everybody else is doing in the population. And the idea that, again, individual variations, if that variation is heritable and allows you to leave more copies of yourself in the next generation, compared than other individuals, then you will have higher fitness than other individuals in a particular environment, right? And so again, those variations that allow an individual to leave more offspring, either by just having more offspring at any particular time or surviving longer, which allows you more reproductive opportunities, or some combination of those. So any characteristics that increase generally your survivability and or reproductive output are going to increase your fitness relative to other individuals in your population. So it's always relative, and it's always specific to a particular environment, right? Because characteristics that help in one environment might actually be less helpful or not helpful at all, or actually detrimental depending on the environment. So it's always environment specific in terms of whether a characteristic is going to be helpful or not. And if it's helpful, right, then we would refer to those as adaptations, right? So just defining again what we mean by relative fitness. Again, it's compared to everybody else in your population. Fitness is basically survival ability plus your reproductive success. How many offspring you are able to have. How many copies of yourself are you leaving in the next generation? Relative fitness you also may see expressed, and I will sometimes refer to it this way, as differential reproductive success. But for the most part, I say relative fitness because that includes both reproductive output as well as your ability to survive in a particular environment. But it's always going to be both of those things, right? It's not just survival. It's not just reproductive output. It's both of those things together are your relative fitness. So hopefully that makes sense, right? So you have to have variation. The variation has to be able to be passed down to the next generation, aka be heritable, right? And then the variation has to affect an individual's ability to leave more offspring in the next generation than other individuals in their population. And that's pretty much it, right? Because then the next generation is going to have more of those characteristics, right? And so those adaptations are going to accumulate in the population, and the population evolves as a result of individual differences in fitness. So if a characteristic is not heritable, then you can't select for it, and the population's not going to evolve. If that variation does not affect fitness, That's what we refer to as neutral variation. It just doesn't really have an effect on fitness at all. If it's heritable, it'll get passed down. But then right, it's sort of random. It's just sort of neutral. It's just kind of there. So you do not expect necessarily to see those characteristics increase in the next generation. They might just stay the same, right? That the presence won't increase because they don't have an impact on fitness, right? You can't really select for them because they don't affect an individual's ability to survive or reproduce. Okay, so just as an individual's fitness depends on its environment, this of course means that the same individual may have different fitness in different environments, right? So selection is going to act on the physical expression of the genotype, right? And this is what we call the phenotype. And this, of course, is where that interaction between your genes and your environment comes into play, right? So essentially, selection can't see the genotype directly. It sees the physical expression of that genotype, right? So that's the product of genes plus the environment, and that's what selection is acting on. And the selection is also going to act on the whole phenotype at the same time, not just particular aspects, right? Although that's often how we talk about selection, is with regard to a particular feature or trait, say flower color or tail length or something like that. We talk about selection acting on a particular characteristic and whether that population is evolving or not with respect to that particular characteristic. That's often just because it's easier to deal with it that way and not have to take into account all of the characteristics of an organism, right? Again, also you may have characteristics that are present that were under selective pressure, right? They did affect fitness at some point, and then everybody has them now, right? So they no longer really give you a fitness advantage. And so we talk about those characteristics are really no longer evolving because everyone's got them, right? So there's no change that's possible because everybody has the same characters. Now you can imagine an individual that doesn't have that character would be at a disadvantage, right? You'd have a loss of fitness if you don't have it, but just having it isn't increasing your fitness more than everybody else in the population because everybody else has got that, right? That particular character. So we always have to remember what selection is actually seeing or acting on, and it's the phenotype. It's the different physical expression. And again, this is very environment specific. What works in one environment is not going to necessarily work in another environment. Selection can also only work on variation that exists right now. And that has two possible consequences, right? It means that selection can't create variation. It can't give an organism what it needs to survive and reproduce, right? It can only act on what is present at that point in time. And of course, we know selection is not the one that's creating the variation in the first place either, right? Selection actually decreases variation, right? Because you're eliminating individuals from the population, those that have very low fitness, right? That means they're not passing on their genes very well. They're not surviving very well. And that means that they're going to leave fewer copies of their genes in the following generation. And that fewer might be as little as 0, right? You don't leave any of your genes in the next generation. Your fitness is 0. And your genes aren't getting passed on, which means they're being eliminated from the gene pool. And so it's effectively, selection is picking and choosing the variations that have high fitness in a particular environment, and everybody else generally decreases and goes away. So essentially, selection is reducing the amount of variability in a particular environment. Selection also is, like I said, can only work on what's present at a given point in time, which means that right now is constrained by what happened in the previous generation or the previous 10 generations, right? You may be selecting for particular characteristics because they have an effect on fitness, and that's going to, again, eliminate the variations that don't positively impact fitness. Well, let's just say the environment changes and suddenly the variations that existed 3 generations ago would actually help now. Well, and unfortunately, you're kind of like, well, I guess that's just tough noogies, because that variation is gone. It was selected against, and it's gone. Even though hey, now I need it. Well, unfortunately, there's nothing we can do about that, right? So this is why biologists are so obsessed with maintaining genetic variation in wildlife populations, because you sort of never know what variations that maybe were neutral before. They were just sort of there, but they didn't affect fitness, but they didn't hurt. So they weren't selected against, but they just sort of carried along, just kind of their background variation. And the environment changes, and suddenly having that variability actually helps. And now the individuals that have those variations that were previously neutral actually have a fitness advantage, and they can survive and reproduce as the environment changes. And so that's why we're sort of obsessed with maintaining a genetic variation in populations, because we don't know what the environment's going to do in the next generation or in a few generations after that. So bonus point, I refer to this particular slide. This beaver is my Bruce Campbell, Evil Dead Bruce Campbell beaver. So any extra points for people who get the pop culture reference if they've ever watched Ash versus the Undead or Evil. Anyway, I know it's not a Pokemon reference. It's a old zombie movie reference, which actually they just did a reboot on HBO, with Bruce Campbell reprising his character. So he gets attacked by zombies, and in the fight he loses one of his hands, and so he takes a chainsaw and straps it to his arm. So he always has a weapon against the zombies on his arm. So that's where that's where that came from. Anyway, so that's just random. Okay, so I mentioned that the environment is essentially choosing which variations, which phenotypes are going to be successful in an environment, right? And by successful, we mean having good fitness, right? Meaning you're passing on more copies of yourself to the next generation, either through having increased reproductive success or increased survival, or if you're really in good shape, both of those things. So you have higher fitness relative to other individuals in a population. And again, the environment this is why Darwin referred to this as natural selection. It's nature is what is deciding who does well and who doesn't, right? And of course, the individuals that have characteristics that don't allow them to leave more offspring or survive better, their combinations are going to be eliminated from the gene pool because they have very low fitness or no fitness. The aspect of the environment that is basically choosing who has fitness, high fitness, in a particular environment is what we refer to as the agent of selection. Now, a given individual is probably under pressure from multiple agents of selection, right? It may be multiple things going on in their world, right? They have to avoid predators. They need to be able to get enough food. You have to deal with the changes to the physical environment, like temperature, which is, climate change is a huge agent of selection right now for everyone, everywhere. So you're likely to have multiple agents of selection that are involved. And as I mentioned, it's going to act on the whole phenotype at the same time. But again, we usually talk about just one characteristic and whether it's under selective pressure or not at any given moment. Basically, okay, is this particular characteristic evolving? And that's mostly just for our convenience because it's really it's hard enough to measure evolution in a characteristic especially microevolution, if we're looking at changes in gene frequencies between generations, it's hard enough to do that with one character, let alone, 50 zillion. But the other thing we have to remember is it's individual differences. It's that differential reproductive success, right, or relative fitness. It's individual differences in their survival and reproductive success that leads to evolution at the population level. It's leading to the accumulation of those adaptations that Darwin was referring to. And so it's those individual differences that lead to populations that evolve. Individuals, right, do not evolve. They have fitness, and they may adapt in the sense that we talk about, oh, they're adapting to their environment. That's a sort of colloquial term for getting used to, right, their environment, or they're acclimatizing to their environment. Again, individuals can learn, but that learning may or may not be able to be inherited to the next generation. And if it's not, then that characteristic won't evolve, right? And so the next generation will have to learn all over again, right? So a lot of what we refer to as, oh, they're adapting to their environment is actually really just their learning. And it's not adaptation in the sense that we refer to here, which is a characteristic that's inherited from the previous generation. And so therefore individuals, again, have fitness, but populations evolve. So we're going to look at a little example here, and I've got a video clip coming up here.
That turkey talks ragtime. Blah, blah, blah.
This is Kermit the Frog, speaking to you from the planet Coosbane, and today I'm interviewing a most unfortunate creature, the Coosbanian Foob.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. As a matter of fact, I'm pleased to be anywhere.
I can believe that, because you see, folks, the Foob is known as the most delicious creature on Coosbane.
That's true. We have a saying on this world. I never met a Foob I didn't like, especially with mushroom gravy.
I suppose this tends to hold down the Foob population pretty effectively?
Not really. Actually, my species is flourishing.
Really? Well, how do you manage that?
Evolution.
I don't think I understand.
We Foobs tend to evolve rather faster than most creatures.
Mm-hmm. Well, what do you evolve into?
Oh, whatever's handy.
I beg your pardon?
We try to blend in with the crowd as best we can.
Say, are you changing?
Evolving. Evolving is the accurate term.
Yeah, but you're starting to look familiar.
I should certainly hope so.
This is very weird. Good grief. Even your clothes are the same.
It's called the survival of the trench-coated.
But you can't do this. This is Kermit the Frog returning you to... I'm Kermit the Frog! I am! These are Kermit the Frogs returning you to the Muppet Show. You can't do that! I'm the real Kermit, folks.
Wonderful, very funny, eh, Waldorf? I wonder where he went. He was here a minute ago watching the Foob and falling down laughing.
I'm still falling, but I've stopped laughing. Mr. Statler, there aren't too many people on this show I'd like to talk to.
Well, I can understand that. They're kind of weird.
Weird is too nice a word. But you and your friend seem to be very distinguished gentlemen. By the way, where is your friend?
Oh, I don't know. He must have stepped out for a minute.
Stepped out is right. Hey, give me a hand, huh?
Well, I'm sure he didn't go far. Yeah, he's probably hanging around somewhere.
Hanging around is right. Help! Mr. Statler, what I find hard to understand is why you come here every night.
Well, it gets me out of the house.
But there are many better places to go than this freak show. Oh, there's the symphony, the ballet, the opera.
Never go to the opera. Can't stand all that screaming and yelling.
You just don't understand opera.
Oh, I understand it all right. I just hate it. Rather go to a public hanging.
You are at a public hanging.
pull me up!
Does your friend Waldorf feel as strongly as you?
I don't have any feeling at all. My hand is numb.
Yeah, I don't know. Why don't you ask him?
Maybe I will. I will drop by later.
I'm gonna drop right now if somebody doesn't help me.
But, wherever he is, it's good to know that at least we have you two gentlemen here to provide dignity and decency.
Okay, so if the goal of selection is essentially shaping populations such that they are very well suited to the environment that they're in, why don't we see organisms that are perfectly adapted, right? In every way, they're perfectly adapted to their environment, right? To the point where populations are no longer evolving, right? Because they're perfect and they don't need to evolve anymore. Well, of course, we have various reasons, right? You're never going to be perfectly adapted, right? And part of that is the environment's always changing. So what was selected for in the past is now going to affect the ability of organisms to possibly, right, adapt in the future. So for instance, adapting to use a particular food source and be a specialist would be great, right? And you have an advantage. Maybe you can access a food source that nobody else can eat. You've got the market all to yourself. You only have to compete with other members of your species. And that's all well and good. But perhaps if something happens to that food source, you may be so adapted to using that that you're not able to switch food sources later on, right? You don't have the ability to use an alternate food source because again you've been so selected for this specialist type of interaction. We also know it's not possible, and it's never possible, and all of us know this, right? To maximize everything all the time, right? We know if we have more work to do, right, we're probably going to have to sacrifice something else that we would like to spend time doing, right? Like sleep. Hopefully not. But we might say, well, I can't go out this week because I've got a test to study for. I can't go clubbing, or whatever it is. I know I've got X going on, and so Y has to give. And so that's very, very true in nature as well, right? So adaptations for, again, a particular lifestyle might make it harder for you to accomplish something else. Or again, it may be a trade-off. You have a choice if you can do X or Y, but you can't do both. And so again, adaptations, for example, to be faster might limit your ability to turn. For example, it's just not possible to maximize everything. You can't maximize growth and reproduction at the same time, right? Because we only have so much energy that you have to devote. So you have to make some choices. You have to make there's always a trade-off that exists. There are also constraints that exist. There are laws of, the laws of physics in terms of physical limitations to how fast molecules can diffuse across a membrane. Or how the limit we were talking about to how fast nerves can fire, right? You're limited by the ability of the sodium-potassium pump to reestablish resting potential. So at some point you're going to reach, the maximum rate at which ions can move across a membrane, and that's going to be your limit to how fast something can happen. Unless something else changes and increases the limit, you've reached that. And so it's, there's going to become a point where you can't run any faster, for example. And then, of course, selection is constrained based on the variation that exists right now, right? If you don't have the variation for selection to act on to produce a particular adaptation, right? Selection can't give us what we need, right? Just because we need it. It doesn't matter how desperately we need that variation. If it doesn't exist, then there's nothing you can really, that can be done about that. Selection has to have that variation to act on. And if it does, if the variation just doesn't exist, then you're sort of stuck. And so you may be limited in that aspect in terms of producing any types of adaptations that are even anywhere close to perfect. Because again, we know the environment's also always changing, so I would probably add that to this list as well. And so you're trying to hit a moving target, and that's also going to be a factor in terms of limiting the ability of populations to evolve.
Herbivores have powerfully muscled hind legs that give them superlative acceleration. Invaluable if you're caught unawares. Once again, numbers bring safety. The North American pronghorn is the second fastest sprinter on the planet, but over long distances it's the world champion. But all large herbivores have to be able to run fast. They run on tiptoe so that they cover more ground with each stride. Muscles are bunched at the top of the legs so that the limbs are streamlined. Some grazers flaunt their athleticism as if to say, I'm fit, so save your energy and pick on someone weaker. Cheetahs may be the fastest sprinters, but gazelles are better at dodging and jinking. Slimline legs, however, trip only too easily. And having eyes on the side of your head so that you can't see directly forward can be catastrophic. Even so, herbivores manage to outmaneuver their enemies more often than you might suppose. Kicking hooves and thrusting horns are formidable weapons. This mother is going to defend her fawn, come what may. A buffalo has incautiously strayed away from its herd. It surely can have no defense against a group of lions. But the rest of the herd have noticed. Faced with the threat of hundreds of tons of massed anger, the lioness turns tail. The male lion, however, seems unwilling to give up. The buffalo, with their heavy armament, have won this particular battle. But the war on the plains is a never-ending one.
Okay, so we've been talking a lot about the effect of selection on populations, right, and how it's a force for evolutionary change. But another factor that can also cause populations to evolve, meaning they change over time, is genetic drift. And we don't focus a lot on genetic drift, mostly because it's random. And the effects of genetic drift tend to be really small in large, healthy populations, but when you are either starting with or ending with a very small population that's a result of a random change, then you can have really big impacts to the population, specifically the population's genetic variation. So genetic drift is basically random fluctuations in allele frequencies, right? And remembering that alleles are different versions of genes. And one of the ways we measure evolutionary change between generations is looking at the change in allele frequencies, right? Which again should reflect changes in phenotype frequencies, right? Because allele is a form of a genotype, and genes plus environment equals phenotype, right? So we should see those changes in genetic frequencies manifest themselves in changes in the physical expression that we see and can actually measure. Those are one of the ways that we measure evolutionary change. Genetic drift, of course, we have to remember it's a random change, so it has absolutely nothing to do with how well suited an individual is to a particular environment or their fitness. It's a random effect. And as I mentioned, again, in large populations, those random changes sort of tend to balance each other out. They don't tend to have a really large impact. But when you take a really small sample from a really big population, and anybody who's ever done any kind of science, which I know is all of you guys, can appreciate this. If you take a really small sample, right, from a big population, you can't capture all the variability in that big population in that tiny sample. It's just really not possible, right? This is why when we sample populations for the purpose of doing any kind of an experiment, you do multiple samples, because what you want, right, is to capture the variability in your source population, so that you can determine whether any differences arise from anything that you did to that population and not just the inherent properties of that particular population. So we have two main kinds of genetic drift, and they're essentially two sides of the same coin. One is the founder effect. An example of this, of course, is the Galapagos finches we were talking about earlier, where we had essentially a whole lineage of birds was started with a small sample, we think somewhere between 6 and 12 birds that were blown off course and ended up from the mainland of South America and ended up on the Galapagos Islands, where they started a new population. Good for them, right? They actually got someplace where, hey, there's no predators, and look, oh, there's food. A lot of founder populations end up in places that are inhospitable and don't have what they need, and so they don't get established. But in this case, we actually did have a founder population established by very few individuals. So in terms of genetics, the gene pool that they had was just all of the genes in these 6 to 12 individuals, and that's all they had to work with, right? That's all that selection had to work with initially. So you can imagine, again, if you have a very small gene pool, it makes it difficult to be able to adapt to an environment, because you may not have the variations that are needed. And we know selection can't create variation, it actually eliminates variation. So a bottleneck is sort of the flip side of this, where you start with a large population and you end up with a really small population as a result of basically random deaths. It has nothing to do with individual fitness. And this is actually, unfortunately, most bottlenecks that we know of are human caused. So, for example, northern elephant seals were hunted just really vociferously for couple of decades, and we started with a population that was roughly, best guess is about 500,000 individuals, about somewhere between 300 and 500,000 individuals, down to a population. They physically observed 22 individuals on a beach, but knowing how ocean going these seals are, most of the population at any given point is actually out in the water. Our best guess is somewhere around 100. So you can imagine that's a huge population size reduction, right? And so you've essentially eliminated, 95% or more of your genetic variation in that population as a result of this particular event. You ended up with a population size that was very, very small in comparison to where it started, and it was random which individuals were harvested. So they initially would target males, but basically would take anything. It's not a selective event, right? It's a random event. And so the things to remember about genetic drift is, again, it's a random change in allele frequencies, and you are most definitely going to get a loss of genetic variation in your population that's been subjected to drift. So as a result of losing genetic variation, sometimes what happens, and again, it's because it's random, you end up with a loss of alleles such that you may only have one version of a gene that's left in a particular population. So here we have an example of getting to gene, what we call allele fixation, meaning there's only one version of a gene left in a population over the course of 2 generations by just random sampling. So in generation 1, right, we have one individual that is expressing a white flower. Little r allele codes for white flowers, and it's recessive. So any individual that has at least one dominant R allele, the big R, is going to express red flowers. So some of them may be carrying that little R allele, some of them may not be. As we see, we've got a mix, right, of individuals who are homozygous dominant and individuals who are heterozygous. So they randomly select 5 individuals in generation 1 to reproduce. And we know that that happens in life, right? Not everybody's equally likely to reproduce. Some of it is the result of fitness, and some of it's the result of just random chance, right? So here they take a random sample. Here's our next generation 2. We notice, interestingly, we actually have more white-flowered individuals. We have more individuals who are homozygous recessive. But if we select 2 individuals randomly to reproduce, as we can see in the picture here, the 2 individuals we chose are both homozygous dominant. And so we just let them reproduce, and then by generation 3, right, we have a population where the big R allele has gone to fixation, basically. You've lost the little R allele, and everybody has red flowers. Not because there is some sort of selective advantage to red flowers, but because you randomly lost the little R allele as a result of genetic drift. So again, any losing genetic variation may be detrimental to your population. But if you have an allele that goes to fixation, if that allele actually carries with it maybe some negative effects, such as birth defects and other things like that, this could be a really big problem for populations. And I'm just going to mention inbreeding really briefly. This is I shouldn't say sometimes, often occurs in small populations, but it depends on the relatedness of the individuals that you have to begin with, and it depends on the breeding system of the species, how much outcrossing is able to happen. But if you're a small population and your choice of reproductive partners is limited, and you're forced to breed with relatives, usually starting with very distant relatives, but still, because you're related, right, individuals are likely to carry a lot of the same genes, and our negative alleles quite often are recessive. And so you don't see them expressed until someone is homozygous recessive, and your chance of being homozygous recessive is increased if you're breeding with relatives. So that makes this possibility of of having alleles go to fixation sort of compounds the problem in terms of its effects on population viability. So a population recovering from a bottleneck or growing after a founder event may recover their actual physical size fairly quickly. Elephant seals, for example, have actually rebounded in less than 100 years to numbers that are very similar to we think to their previous population size. Now, having said that, the variation that they lost is going to take a lot longer to recover. So when you compare the population variation, the genetic variation in northern elephant seals to southern elephant seals, and southern elephant seals were not hunted the same way as northern elephant seals, you see a really big difference in terms of much lower genetic variation is present in northern elephant seals compared to southern elephant seals. So because essentially, right, you have to wait for mutations, which is our only version of new alleles, right? So you have to wait for mutations to rebuild the different versions of genes that may be present, and they may not be the same ones that were present before, right? And so that's just sort of where you're at. And so populations that have gone through a bottleneck, again, quite often are suffering from the effects of low genetic variation for years and years afterwards. We also have to remember that the changes, of course, are going to be that they experience in terms of the loss of genetic variation. What gets lost is going to be random, and it's unpredictable. Likewise, any changes in allele frequencies that occur in large populations due to drift can be random and unpredictable, and sometimes can build up over time, sort of the way that mutations do. And the only reason I bring this up is because we do have some morphological characteristics that seem to have evolved as a result of drift in some populations. But we do know, again, the big practical upshot of genetic drift is generally that loss of variation. And we know that populations that have low genetic variation have difficulty in responding to environmental changes, right? There may not be any individuals that have phenotypes that allow them to be successful when the environment changes, and the environment's always changing. And of course, we now know, for example, right now we're dealing with climate change. And that's exerting tremendous selective pressures on populations, and our populations in threatened and endangered species quite often are small populations that have lost variation, in some cases as a result of drift. And it just makes it really hard for those populations to respond in a way that some individuals have at least some fitness and can continue reproducing and surviving in the new environment. Okay, so just looking at one example of basically selection at work and watching, we could watch population evolution happen, really. So folks hopefully are, well, maybe familiar with peppered moth example. These are moths that are indigenous to Britain, in particular forests in southern England on the outskirts of London. And these were very common in 19th century birch forests. So that's 19th century, that means 1800s, right? So this is round about the Industrial Revolution when folks were started noticing that this population of moths was evolving. And as you can see in the photograph, right, we have the very common speckled form, which is really hard to spot on the background of lichen on a tree, because it's basically a black and white mottled pattern, and it blends in very nicely to the background. Every generation, there's a certain percentage of individuals, a relatively low percentage, that are born in with the melanic body type, basically all black. And these guys, as you can imagine, basically stood out like sore thumbs, right? And as you can see from the photograph, it's relatively easy to pick out the melanic-form moth, whereas the speckled one blends in really, really nicely to the background. So along comes, human activities and coal-fired power plants and things like that. And they weren't, cleaning the air like they do now. And so you ended up with a lot of soot, which is, of course, black, that was picked up by the prevailing winds and dropped basically in the forests to the west and north of London. And so you had trees that were covered with soot, and this killed the lichen, and of course also you have soot-covered trees, which is black. And so essentially you had the environment reversed, the conditions reversed. And now it was the black form that blended in and the speckled form that stood out. And so again, you can imagine the birds are going to take the low-hanging fruit, right? And they went after the speckled form because it stood out. It was easy to hunt. It was easy to detect. And so the incidence of the melanic form, of course, went up in popularity. So it went from being a very small proportion of the population to over 95% of the population was the melanic form in just I want to say about a decade or so. It didn't take all that long for that pretty major change to happen. So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to ask you guys about the scenario. I'm going to give you additional information in the question and then ask you some questions about this. But otherwise, we are done with this lecture.